Of the executives currently running a Hollywood studio, someone who's had quite an impressive career is Michael De Luca. Right now, he's in charge of Warner Brothers Pictures, but he has not just been a suit. De Luca began his film career as an intern at New Line Cinema, where he would spend several years moving up the ladder. He also had aspirations of being a screenwriter, with his first writing credit appearing on a low-budget student film based on Stephen King's The Lawnmower Man. De Luca also wrote 7 episodes of the television series Freddy's Nightmares at New Line. He would then write the screenplay for the 6th Nightmare on Elm Street movie Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare. In the 80s, he wrote an original script titled In the Mouth of Madness, which was eventually produced by New Line, with John Carpenter directing the film. His love for cinema and finding appealing scripts impressed the studio's founder, Bob Shaye, and he was promoted to president and chief operating officer of New Line in 1993, primarily tasked to look for projects that would appeal to a younger audience. One of the projects he was passionate about was The Mask, which was originally developed as a horror film before director Chuck Russell turned into a comedy. He already saw the star potential in Jim Carrey, and shortly after Ace Ventura hit it big, he quickly scooped him up to star in Dumb and Dumber. He was a big champion of the script for Seven and hiring David Fincher to direct, even though his only feature film at that point was Alien 3, and it received critical acclaim and strong numbers. He took a chance on Mike Myers' 60s spy movie spoof Austin Powers' International Man of Mystery, and that performed well at the box office, exploded on video, and spawned even more successful sequels. Another hit comedy he picked up was Friday, recognizing the humor in its neighborhood antics. He similarly saw potential in the political satire Wag the Dog and Gary Ross's directorial debut Pleasantville, which mixed a sitcom setting with fantastical premise and social commentary. De Luca's philosophy when selecting which movies to make was based on how much he liked the script and saw potential in the director more so than what might be the most commercial, and as you can see, that instinct was one that did seem to work, as he often took on these daring and original ideas. While running his executive job, he did not entirely let go of his love for screenwriting and did some moonlight work outside of New Line. De Luca contributed to the CBS crime show Dark Justice, receiving writing credits on 5 episodes. He pitched an episode idea to Star Trek Voyager, with Brown and Braga writing the final script, although Braga later admitted he was disappointed with how the episode turned out. De Luca also received a story credit on the comic book movie Judge Dredd. Although that film went through so many screenwriters, it's likely little of his material made it on screen. Back at New Line, one of his most fruitful director partnerships was with Paul Thomas Anderson. After 20th Century Fox rejected his script for Boogie Nights, De Luca excitedly picked up the film. Although there were a few behind-the-scenes disagreements related to the runtime and making sure it received an R rating, Anderson ultimately got to make the movie he wanted, which received critical acclaim, 3 Oscar nominations, and did okay at the box office. De Luca would give him a blank check to do whatever he wanted on his next movie, which became Magnolia. That film is similarly praised, and there are some, like myself, who even consider that to be Anderson's masterpiece. Meanwhile, he picked up the Adam Sandler vehicle The Wedding Singer, which proved a sizable hit, and when Disney decided not to make Rush Hour, De Luca scooped it up for New Line, and that became a big success, spawning a franchise. He took on a potentially controversial film with American History X, which, despite some disagreements with the director on the final cut and ultimately taking Edward Norton's side on which version to release, the finished film was critically acclaimed and earned Norton an Oscar nomination. He also championed Blade at a time when comic movies were seen as risky, and Marvel had a lack of hit movies. Despite showing a talent for finding hits, De Luca still had to answer to Bob Shaye, who had final greenlight approval. 2 scripts De Luca was very keen on making were Rushmore and Being John Malkovich, again an example of his love for offbeat and unique ideas. However, Shaye was less enthusiastic and even suggested Being John Malkovich should be about Tom Cruise instead, so De Luca watched as those films were made at other studios. His and Shaye's different approaches to the kinds of films New Line should make, and the added pressure of the studio now being owned by Time Warner, did lead to difficulties between them. De Luca would also earn a reputation in Hollywood for his rowdy partying and wild nights on the town. However, a string of successes kept him employed at New Line. That was until 2000, when New Line saw a number of box office disappointments, which were largely attributed to De Luca's choice of projects. These included Spike Lee's satire Bamboozled, the Cuban Missile Crisis drama 13 Days, and the Adam Sandler comedy Little Nicky. And then there was the runaway production of the comedy Town and Country. Starring Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton, that movie originally started filming in the summer of 1998 on a $44 million budget. However, De Luca would watch as it went wildly over schedule. There were constant script rewrites during production, far more than the usual amount films typically have, and the film even came back for reshoots about 2 years after it started principal photography. It was a mess, which De Luca himself partly took the blame for, and the budget ballooned out of control. Even before Town and Country was finally released in theaters in spring 2001 and flopped, De Luca was fired from his position at New Line. He was originally offered a deal to produce movies for New Line, but he instead decided to accept an invitation to become head of production at DreamWorks Pictures. He would still receive executive producer credits on movies he oversaw development on at New Line, though, including I Am Sam, John Q, and the sequels Rush Hour 2 and Blade 2. While at DreamWorks, he seemed to particularly latch on to comedies, and gave the go-ahead to produce ones like Chris Rock's Head of State, Todd Phillips' Old School, and Adam McKay's Anchorman: The Legend of Ron Burgundy. Although De Luca also approved other types of films too, including the North American distribution rights to the drama House of Sand and Fog. However, some of the comedies he championed made little dent at the box office, like Envy, Winter Date with Tan Hamilton, Surviving Christmas, and Eurotrip, although the latter at least picked up an audience on DVD. One issue he encountered at DreamWorks was getting approval for projects from studio heads Walter Parkes and Laurie McDonald. That, coupled with the disappointing gross on some of the movies he developed, led to him leaving DreamWorks in 2004 and signing a first-look producing deal with Sony Pictures. The science fiction adventures of Thor was the first movie he produced as part of this Sony deal, which received positive reviews but also an underwhelming box office performance. He also became attached to the superhero movie Ghost Rider and the card-playing drama 21. A film he produced outside of Sony was The Love Guru, due to his prior association with Mike Myers on Austin Powers. Released by Paramount, the film was a critical and commercial dud. One of his most notable successes as a producer was The Social Network, whose depiction of the creation of Facebook received excellent reviews, strong box office, and would earn De Luca his first Oscar nomination for Best Picture. A project he was especially passionate about was the baseball movie Moneyball. That was one of the first films he signed on to produce at Sony, but it took a long journey to reach the screen, including when Sony briefly pulled the plug over creative differences with director Steven Soderbergh. After Bennett Miller was hired to direct and Aaron Sorkin was brought in to perform rewrites, the film was given the go-ahead. The final film led to De Luca receiving his second Best Picture nomination. Another acclaimed real-life drama he produced that got a Best Picture nomination was Captain Phillips. In between these prestige films, De Luca produced genre fare for Sony and other studios, like the Nicolas Cage action film Drive Angry, the Jonah Hill comedy The Sitter, and the horror movie Dracula Untold, which was rumored to start a Universal Monsterverse, but obviously didn't. He even returned to DreamWorks for a bit to produce the remake of Fright Night. De Luca became attached as a producer on the film adaptation of the 50 Shades of Grey books. The author, E.L. James, who attained a lot of creative control as part of a deal with Universal, personally selected him to produce the movie, although a heavy say over the production makes it difficult to know how much input he had. In 2013, he became president of production at Sony Pictures, although he was not there for very long. After Amy Pascal was fired as studio chief following the infamous email hack, De Luca was considered for a position, which ultimately went to Tom Rothman. Rothman still wanted to retain De Luca, but decided to sign a first-look producing deal with Universal instead. However, it did not amount to anything, and he primarily produced independent films like Under the Silver Lake and The Sisters Brothers, as well as The Kitchen and Reminiscence for Warner Brothers. In 2020, he was hired as the new chairman at MGM, later bringing on board Pamela Abney to help run the studio. He got to work picking up a number of movies, including the musical Cyrano and Ridley Scott's House of Gucci. He even tried to acquire Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, but Apple took it instead. De Luca did buy the rights to Andy Weir's science fiction novel Project Hail Mary for MGM, eventually bringing on board Phil Lord and Christopher Miller to direct, based on a suggestion by Ryan Gosling. And when Focus Features pulled out of Paul Thomas Anderson's Licorice Pizza, De Luca called up his old friend and brought the film to MGM. Meanwhile, the boxing drama The Fire Inside, which De Luca was originally producing as part of his deal with Universal, was acquired by MGM after the studio put in turnaround. It seemed like a lot of his New Line instincts were coming back for his time running MGM. After only 2 years on that job, De Luca and Abney were whisked away to Warner Brothers Pictures and put in charge of running that studio. They made the same decisions they were making at MGM by making bold choices, although one of their first greenlights was a sequel to Joker. In their defense, any studio would have approved a sequel to that billion-dollar hit, and nobody predicted what disaster it would turn out to be. Some rumors were reported in the trades that Warner Brothers Discovery CEO David Zaslav was considering firing De Luca and Abney, although when those articles were written, few of the films they personally approved had been released, and they were mostly dealing with their previous regime's productions. Everyone's tune started to change when Warner Brothers began releasing hit after hit, starting with a Minecraft movie. Although a film based on one of the most popular video games in the world doing well was not surprising. Ryan Coogler's Sinners is what really showed their ability to pick up projects that would excite audiences. Famously agreeing to give Coogler the rights to the film after 25 years, that movie was a major word-of-mouth hit and eventually received the most Oscar nominations in history, along with winning 4 trophies. There was also Zach Cregger's horror film Weapons, which they bought after an intense bidding war, and that also did extremely well, along with Amy Madigan winning an Oscar for playing the film's villain. Meanwhile, they made the smart decision to switch Final Destination Bloodlines from a streaming release to theatrical, where it became the most well-received and highest-grossing film in the franchise. Warner Brothers signed a distribution deal with Apple to handle the theatrical release of F1, which was another winner for them. De Luca would reunite with Paul Thomas Anderson when he and Abney gave him by far his biggest budget for one battle after another. That easily became Anderson's highest-grossing film, and while likely lost money in its theatrical run, his films have a history of a long shelf life, which will be further helped by the movie winning Best Picture. Not to say De Luca and Abity have not greenlit a few flops here and there, and they've also had to deal with David Zaslav annoyingly turning completed films into tax write-offs. However, these disappointments have been far outweighed by the hits and their commitment to championing auteur-driven films and exciting horror movies, along with the usual franchise fare any studio has now. Because sometimes you need to take a swing on the next Alejandro Gonzalez Inarritu film, and sometimes you need to make a Hello Kitty movie. Researching Michael De Luca's career for this video, I became even more impressed with what he's been able to accomplish and see him translate his love for cinema into supporting talented filmmakers and helping them bring these stories to the screen. And whether he continues at Warner Brothers or eventually goes elsewhere, it'll be interesting to see what he does. See you next time.